Peter, I want to direct the next question at you. First of all, do you agree with Marshall and what he's saying? And would a rate hike at this particular time be a good thing?
Well, first of all, I don't think that what the Fed has done is unprecedented. I think history is littered with nations that have been destroyed by the type of monetary policy that we're pursuing. But I think the Fed needs to raise interest rates badly. They should have raised them years ago. But the reason they won't raise them is because they don't want to pop the bubble that they inflated. We don't have a real recovery. Thanks to the Federal Reserve, we have a gigantic bubble. The Fed has prevented a recovery from taking place, and so they've never intended to raise rates. The problem is economies work best under a free market, not centrally planned economies. But we have turned over interest rates to central planners, and they make huge mistakes, predictably. And now we stand on the precipice, I believe, of a worse financial crisis than the one we had in 2008, thanks to the actions of the Federal Reserve.
Do you think the simultaneous rise in the U.S. dollar and U.S. asset markets simply reflects the influx of money into the U.S.?
Well, it certainly reflects the opinion, which I think is completely wrong, that the U.S. is enjoying a legitimate recovery rather than a bubble, and the expectation that the Federal Reserve is going to be raising interest rates. Neither of those expectations are true. We don't have a real recovery. It is a bubble, and the last thing the Fed is going to do is prick it intentionally. I think we're going to have quantitative easing for QE4. That's around the corner. The Fed doesn't want to admit that because it would be very destructive to actually admit the predicament. So it wants to pretend that everything is okay, that it's intending to raise interest rates at some point in the future, even though it knows that its next policy is going to be another round of quantitative easing. So I think the currency speculators who are betting incorrectly on the U.S. economy and on tighter monetary policy, I think they're going to lose a lot of money, and ultimately the dollar is going to collapse. And certainly the U.S. stock markets have been the beneficiary of a lot of foreign safe haven money because investors in U.S. stocks have also enjoyed the gains of the U.S. dollar when they look at their returns in their respective currencies. But when the dollar starts to head south, that will also undermine the real return on U.S. stocks, and I think there could be a lot of selling coming from abroad.
Please, Peter, go ahead. Jump in there.
Yeah, people also overlook that exporting is a means to an end. You only export to pay for your imports. And when you debase your currency, you make it harder. You make your imports more expensive, and now you have to work harder to be able to afford them. What you really want as a society is a strengthening currency that enhances your purchasing power, that enriches your people. That's how standards of living grow. It's when you can produce more stuff, and therefore the price of stuff comes down, and your consumers can afford to buy more things because their money is more valuable and costs go down. But you have all these governments working at odds with that type of progress.
Peter, I'm sorry to cut you off.
I rise today in opposition to secrecy, in opposition to the veil of secrecy that closes the money changing that takes place in the temple of the Federal Reserve. While the money changes hands, the moneyed class gets richer and the middle class gets shortchanged.
Now, that was Rand Paul talking about audit the Fed legislation, obviously, and I'm going to direct this one to you.
Well, 2 points I wanted to address. First, the one about capital requirements and the FDIC. It's the FDIC that is the problem. It is the moral hazard created by the FDIC that leads to inadequate capital. If we had a free market in banking without government guarantees, then the market would set the capital requirements. Banks would have to have enough capital to attract deposits on their own. It's the government that has poisoned the well, and all the problems are the result of that, not some failure of the free market. But more importantly, I want to address the idea that somehow things have improved thanks to the Federal Reserve. It is highly exaggerated by the proponents of central banking that prior to the Federal Reserve that we had all this volatility in the U.S. economy. The truth is that economic growth in America before the Federal Reserve was much greater, and the standard of living of typical Americans rose much faster before the Fed than after. And there's no question that had the monetary system that existed prior to the Federal Reserve creation in 1913, today America would be a much wealthier nation, and American citizens would enjoy a far higher standard of living than they do today. The Federal Reserve has been very destructive to the U.S. economy, and the real amount of that destruction is going to be far more evident when this enormous bubble, this is the biggest of all the bubbles that they've inflated, pops. And the real enormity of the problems will be laid bare. And Americans, unfortunately, are going to go through an economic period far worse than the one that we went through during the Great Depression, which, by the way, took place on the Federal Reserve's watch. We didn't have anything like the Great Depression prior to the Federal Reserve, but we had it with the Federal Reserve.
Well, you know, I know that you guys want to step in there, but we're going to have to switch over to a different topic. And I'm going to go back to you, Peter, on this. We're going to move over to Europe. What is going on in Europe? The European Central Bank has moved to negative interest rates and quantitative easing. What do you make of this?
Look, this is economic policy to the absurd, where you have central bankers who are now so delusional that they believe that inflation is somehow the holy grail of economic growth. And central banks are deliberately slashing interest rates, in some cases into negative territory, deliberately to create inflation, under the pretense that it's necessary for economic growth, when in reality, economies grow more rapidly when consumer prices are declining. Declining consumer prices lead to increased consumption because you can buy more things when the things that you're buying are less expensive. And businesses profit more when they can bring down costs because they expand their market. And so this is all nonsense. Central banks are really trying to inflate asset bubbles and bail out politicians who have promised more than they can realistically repay. So instead of forcing politicians to deal with these promises and to cut back on government spending, they are monetizing this. They are trying to inflate these debts away, and so they are leading their nations down this primrose path. It's some kind of promised land of inflation, but they're really leading them to destruction. And ultimately, you know, this is going to backfire. Central banks are going to get a lot more inflation than they bargained for, and it's going to be very difficult to get the genie back in the bottle.
Please, Mark, jump in there, please.
Because I don't know if you could be more backwards in analyzing events than what we've just heard. I mean, look at Europe, you know. They've got twice the unemployment in the Eurozone than we have here. We had this was the epicenter of the world financial crisis and recession. We had a recession that lasted a year and a half. The Eurozone had something similar for about 5 quarters, and then they went back into recession, and they haven't really recovered. And Greece has had 6 years of depression, and Spain and Greece have a quarter of their labor force unemployed. Why is that? It's because the central bank of the Eurozone didn't do what our Federal Reserve did. In fact, they even raised interest rates. Can I finish?
Not at all.
Can I just finish? Because I didn't interrupt you.
But you're suggesting.
Okay, let me just finish my sentence here. Okay, let me finish, and then you can talk as much as you want, okay? This shows you how central bank policy of the kind that right-wing people here want, or no central bank at all if you want, that's what Peter wants, but that's not on the agenda. But if central banks don't play a positive expansionary role in the case of, and in our case it was quantitative easing also helped very much, lowering interest rates to 0 in 2008 and keeping them there. This is the difference between our economy and the Eurozone, and the people of Europe are suffering greatly for what for the monetary policy and not having really their own central bank.
Do you agree with
you're just making an assumption.
Let
me address this point, though.
Let's get Richard in there, because he seems like he wants to say something as well. Go ahead, Richard.
If I can just make some observations. Europe has had a severe recession in terms of unemployment, but this is because of its own anti-market policies, regulations on the business sector, high labor market regulations, subsidies to keep people unemployed for a prolonged period of times and reduce the cost of looking for a job. All of these have to do with non-monetary but regulatory barriers and hindrances to allowing real competitive markets, including labor markets, to work in Europe. And the panacea of the idea that inflation can get people into prosperity is absurd. Whether it's the Central Bank of Europe or the attitude of the Federal Reserve here, the idea is that to have a target of 2% price inflation, okay? Keep in mind that if you had an average rate of 2% price inflation in 20 years, the value of the currency would fall by 20%. Furthermore, It is an illusion to think that this can work. First of all, the only way it can temporarily work, which is an old Keynesian panacea, is that prices are rising more than wages and other costs are going up, so that you create temporarily an artificial profit margin to stimulate job creation. But the point is that the fundamental problem of this is that the money is just not falling from heaven evenly. It, in a ragged and disproportional way, is injected into the economy, distorts investment profitability, the way investment decisions are made, resources are misallocated by this inflationary process, and it distorts the entire patterns of supply and demands throughout the economy. A distortion and an imbalance that eventually requires its own new correction. And therefore, the temporary panacea of inflation sets the grounds for even worse a downturn and readjustment later on. This is following a false path of illusion.
Now, let me just reiterate that. Let me reiterate the fact that what you're doing, it's false logic. You're seeing a problem, high unemployment, and you're assuming that it's resulting from a lack of inflation. The lack of inflation is not the problem. In fact, if inflation were higher, that is going to compound the problems in Europe. The other gentleman is correct. It is the regulatory, the labor policies that are undermining employment in the Eurozone, and just creating more inflation is not going to solve those problems. And you're crediting the Federal Reserve for all the great things that have happened as a result of quantitative easing. Well, we haven't paid the piper yet. I mean, look at the financial crisis of 2008. That was the payback for the economic stimulus that the Federal Reserve put into the economy leading up to 2008. So we haven't gotten the payback from quantitative easing, 1, 2, and 3, and 0% interest rates.
We don't have an $8 trillion housing bubble either. You know, I mean, it's fine. You want to predict catastrophe, then everything's bad, and everything that was done is bad. But if you want to compare the Eurozone, they've done this. They've forced these countries to deregulate their labor markets, to hurt organized labor, to increase it. Look at the reforms they've done in Greece and Spain. What good have they done? What good have they've changed the law. They've laid off a fifth of the public sector labor force in Greece.
Okay,
they've thrown people off.
Mark, I got to cut you off there because I want to go to the Switzerland of this panel, Peter. I want to ask you quickly. You know, how far into negative territory can a Denmark or a Switzerland take interest rates to prevent the hot money from flowing into their markets? Into markets in general.
I don't know, but these policies are self-destructive. You know, any country that fights a currency war loses. You know, the object is to inflict pain on your own people. They need to stay out of it. And, you know, it's doing a lot of harm to these economies because it distorts resource allocation, it influences decision-making, retards real economic growth. You know, I disagree with the statement that quantitative easing has not harmed the U.S. economy. It has done immeasurable harm. We're going to find out how much when the bubble bursts. But the reason that we haven't enjoyed legitimate economic growth, yeah, but it actually harmed it. The reason we haven't had real economic growth in this country is because of the Fed. The average American has seen a substantial degradation in his standard of living. We have economic growth that is created by statisticians. It's not real growth. It's just spending borrowed money, and a lot of it has to do with assuming that there's no inflation when in fact there is, because nominal GDP has been extremely low for the past 4 or 5 years, and it's only because we pretend that there's no inflation that it looks like the economy is growing, but it's not legitimate growth. It's just the spending of borrowed money. The debt has grown a lot faster than the economy.
Now, do you think that central banks, they have to do extreme things like QE only because of stimulus and spending? What do you think?
I think that's partly true.
No, absolutely. You know, no, two wrongs don't make a right. Look, governments can't stimulate the economy by spending money, and central banks don't stimulate by creating money. What stimulates the economy is shrinking the size of government, so it's a smaller burden. We need more production. We need more savings and investment, legitimate savings and investment, not speculation, and governments interfere with that process, and so